I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it. That's the bit that excites me.
There are moments in history that arrive without fanfare, without trumpets, without any of the ceremony that royal tradition demands. Moments so quiet, so deliberately understated that the world barely notices them as they happen. And yet, in the days and weeks that follow, those same quiet moments ripple outward with consequences that shake families, reshape institutions, and redefine the very meaning of power. What happened inside the walls of Buckingham Palace in recent months was precisely one of those moments. On the surface, it looked like nothing. A signature, a procedural adjustment, a few lines of carefully chosen legal language buried inside documents that most people would never read and fewer would ever understand. But behind that silence, behind that deliberately calm exterior, something profound was taking shape. Something that would leave Queen Camilla's closest relatives struggling to process what had just happened to them. And something that would force the entire world to ask a question it had been quietly avoiding for years. Is Prince William already, in every meaningful sense, the king? To understand what happened and why it matters so deeply, you cannot simply look at the present moment. You have to go back. You have to understand the architecture of a family that has spent decades navigating one of the most complicated emotional landscapes in modern history. Because the story of William's first significant act of royal authority is not really a story about paperwork or protocol. It is a story about memory, about grief that never fully healed, about a boy who watched his mother suffer, and a man who never forgot what that suffering looked like. Princess Diana's shadow has never truly lifted from the British royal family. It stretches across decades, across coronations, across weddings and state banquets, and carefully staged public appearances. It is present in the way William carries himself, in the causes he champions, in the particular intensity with which he protects his own children from the kind of exposure that damaged his mother so profoundly. Diana was not simply a beloved public figure to William. She was his foundation, his earliest understanding of what love looked like, what betrayal felt like, and what it meant to be both inside and outside the protection of an institution as powerful and as cold as the British monarchy can sometimes be. Those who knew William during his childhood years have spoken, carefully and always with discretion, about how deeply the breakdown of his parents' marriage affected him. He was not shielded from it. No child in that position could have been fully shielded. The media was everywhere. The whispers were everywhere. And at the center of all of it was a woman whose name became synonymous in the public imagination with everything that had gone wrong inside that royal marriage. Camilla Parker Bowles. Now Queen Camilla. And for William, whatever official titles time and circumstance have bestowed upon her, the emotional complexity of that history has never fully dissolved. This is not to say that William has been openly hostile. He has not. The British royal family operates on a code of controlled presentation that goes far deeper than mere public relations. Emotions are managed. Grievances are contained. Unity is projected even when the private reality tells an entirely different story. For years, William played his part in that projection with discipline and apparent grace. He stood beside Camilla at official events. He appeared in photographs that communicated acceptance, if not warmth. He said the right things in the right settings and allowed the public narrative of reconciliation to take hold. But those who study the royal family closely, who read between the lines of official statements and analyzed the body language of state occasions, have long suggested that beneath the surface, William's feelings about Camilla remain significantly more complicated than any official photograph has ever managed to capture. And then came the shift. The slow, almost imperceptible redistribution of weight inside the palace that began gathering momentum as King Charles's health challenges became more publicly acknowledged. Charles, who has faced his own serious health battles in recent years, found himself stepping back from certain duties. The workload redistributed, the visibility of other senior royals increased, and at the center of that expanding role, increasingly confident and increasingly decisive, stood Prince William. royal commentators began to notice something changing in how William presented himself publicly. There was a new directness to his manner, a new willingness to speak on difficult subjects without the careful hedging that royal tradition usually demands. A new sense, difficult to define precisely but impossible to ignore entirely, that this was a man no longer simply preparing for kingship but already inhabiting it in some essential way. The word that kept appearing in analyses and commentary was intentional. William's moves, people said, were intentional, deliberate, thought through. Not reactive, not emotional, but strategic in the way that only someone thinking about a reign of decades rather than a moment of headlines can be strategic. It was against this backdrop that the document appeared. The piece of paperwork that, at first glance, seemed to belong to the category of administrative routine that palace officials process in their dozens every single week. Legal adjustments, protocol clarifications, the kind of institutional housekeeping that keeps a monarchy functioning smoothly across generations. Staff carried it through corridors without ceremony. It moved from desk to desk without drama. And had it not been for a small number of attentive royal observers who understood its implications, it might have passed entirely unnoticed into the vast archive of royal administrative history. But it did not pass unnoticed, because what that document contained, encoded in the dry language of constitutional procedure, was something that Camilla's family would come to understand as a message. Not a hostile message, not an openly aggressive one, but a message nonetheless. Clear in its intention, firm in its direction, and impossible to misread once you understood what you were actually looking at. The specific details of what the document contained have been subject to considerable interpretation and debate among royal commentators. What the reports suggest, however, is that it related to the question of royal standing, access, and the definition of who belongs, in an official and protected sense, to the inner circle of the monarchy. These are not abstract questions. They have very real consequences for the people they affect. Questions of royal protection, of access to royal residences, of the privileges that come with proximity to the crown, these are matters that touch the daily lives of everyone connected to the royal family. And for Camilla's relatives, people who had, over the years of her remarkable journey from controversial figure to queen consort, found themselves drawn closer to the warmth and security of that royal connection. The implications of any change to those arrangements were deeply personal. Sources close to Camilla's family reportedly described the reaction as one of shock and grief. Not anger, at least not initially, but something closer to the bewildered pain of people who had believed themselves to be in a secure position and who suddenly found that security was less permanent than they had assumed. There were, according to these accounts, tears. There were private conversations conducted in the urgent, hushed tones of people trying to process something they had not anticipated and were not prepared for. There were questions asked of advisors and intermediaries, careful questions designed to understand the full extent of what had changed and whether any of it could be revisited or reconsidered. The answers they received, according to those familiar with the situation, were not encouraging. The decision, whatever its precise nature, appeared to have been made with the kind of finality that signals not a negotiating position, but a settled conclusion. What makes this moment so significant is not simply what it meant for Camilla's family in practical terms. It is what it revealed about the kind of King William intends to be. Because every first act carries within it the seed of everything that follows. Every leader, every institution, every reign announces itself in its opening moves, sometimes loudly and sometimes in the quietest possible way. And what William's opening move announced, if the reports and interpretations of royal observers are to be believed, was this: the monarchy of the future will be defined by proximity to succession and by nothing else. It will not be expanded by marriage connections. It will not be stretched to accommodate the extended families of those who marry into it. It will be focused, lean, purposeful, a working institution oriented around a clear and defensible core rather than an ever-widening circle of associated privilege and expectation. This vision, if that is what it is, has its defenders and its critics in roughly equal measure. Those who support William's apparent direction argue that the monarchy's long-term survival depends on exactly this kind of disciplined focus. They point to the examples of European monarchies that have successfully modernized by becoming smaller, more transparent, and more clearly connected to genuine public service. They argue that a royal family that sprawls outward to include the relatives of every spouse risks losing the clarity of purpose that makes it meaningful to the public that funds it and the nation that defines itself partly through it. In this reading, William is not being cold or punitive. He is being responsible. He is thinking about 2050 and 2075 rather than about the feelings of individuals in the present moment. But his critics see something else in the same actions. They see a man using the language of institutional reform to settle scores that are, at their core, deeply personal. They see Diana's son drawing lines that Diana herself was never powerful enough to draw. They see the grief and anger of a child who watched his mother be made to feel like an outsider by the very institution she had given her life to, now transformed into the authority of a future king who will decide who belongs and who does not. This is a more uncomfortable reading, and William's supporters reject it firmly. But it persists in public conversation because it speaks to something real about the emotional weight that this family has always carried and continues to carry, regardless of how many state banquets or carefully managed public appearances suggest otherwise. The state banquet of November 2024 became, in the eyes of many royal observers, the moment when the private dynamics of all this became briefly, uncomfortably visible to the wider world. Buckingham Palace was, as it always is on such occasions, breathtakingly beautiful. The chandeliers cast their golden light across tables, set with the kind of precision that takes teams of staff days to achieve. Distinguished guests moved through rooms that have witnessed centuries of history. Everything, on the surface, performed the function it was designed to perform, the projection of an institution that is stable, gracious, timeless, and entirely in control of itself. But those watching carefully, those who had been following the developing story of shifts and adjustments within the royal household, noticed things that others might have missed. Arrangements that seemed subtly different from previous occasions, positions that communicated something about where certain individuals stood in the informal hierarchy of royal favor. Moments of interaction, or the notable absence of interaction, that royal watchers immediately began to analyze with an intensity that speaks to how fascinated the public remains by every detail of this family's life. Social media, as it always does now, amplified and accelerated everything. Videos were slowed down and replayed, expressions were examined, lip readers were consulted. Every second of publicly available footage from the evening was subjected to a level of scrutiny that no medieval court could have imagined, and that the current royal family must find both exhausting and alarming. And from all of this analysis, one dominant interpretation emerged. Something had changed. The warmth, the easy inclusion, the sense that Camilla's world had fully merged with the royal world. It looked, to many observers, slightly less certain than it had before. Whether that impression reflected a genuine shift or the projection of an already established narrative onto ambiguous evidence is impossible to say with complete confidence. But the perception, once established, took on a life of its own. In the weeks that followed, the story grew in the way that royal stories always grow, through leaks and counter-leaks, through carefully sourced reports in publications that have cultivated relationships with palace insiders over decades, through the testimony of people described only as those close to the situation or senior royal sources. The details that emerged painted a picture of an institution in the middle of a significant internal renegotiation. Questions about royal titles and who deserved to hold them. Questions about royal residences and who had the right to live in them. Questions about security arrangements and the significant public expense they represent. All of these questions, and the answers being quietly developed to them, pointed in the same direction, toward a smaller, more clearly defined royal family in which the privileges of proximity to the crown would be more carefully rationed than they had been in recent years. Camilla's family found themselves, according to reports, on the wrong side of this renegotiation. Not through any particular fault or transgression, but simply because of where they stood in relation to the structure that William appears to be building. They were connected to the monarchy through Camilla, and Camilla's position, however officially secure in terms of her own title and role, did not automatically translate into permanent security for her wider family network. This is the part of the story that produced the tears that sources described. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a public humiliation, but the quiet, painful realization that a door which had seemed open was being gently but firmly closed. That the warmth they had experienced in recent years had limits that were now becoming apparent. That the future of the monarchy, as William apparently envisions it, had less room for them than the present had seemed to suggest. The episode of the tiara, which emerged as a separate but thematically connected story around the time of Peter Phillips's wedding to Harriet Spurling, added another layer to the developing picture. Tiaras in the royal context are never simply jewelry. They are symbols of belonging, of acceptance, of having been granted access to the history and heritage that the royal collection represents. The question of whether Harriet Spurling would be permitted to wear a tiara from the royal collection for her wedding became, inevitably, a question about something much larger than personal adornment. It became a question about where the boundaries of the royal family were being drawn and who had the authority to draw them. Reports suggested that William became involved in discussions about this question in a way that some interpreted as a direct challenge to Camilla's authority over such decisions. The reports remain unconfirmed in their specifics, but the fact that they circulated so widely and were treated by so many observers as entirely plausible says something important about how William's relationship with Camilla is currently being perceived. King Charles, throughout all of this, has maintained a silence that is itself deeply eloquent. Here is a man who spent decades fighting for the right to love Camilla openly, who insisted on marrying her against considerable opposition, who worked patiently and persistently to bring the institution he would one day lead to accept the woman he had chosen. And now he watches, from a position complicated by his own health challenges and by the natural transfer of energy toward the next generation, as the relationship between his wife and his son plays out in ways that he cannot fully control and may not have fully anticipated. Those who know Charles describe him as someone who genuinely desires peace, who has always preferred to manage tensions through quiet diplomacy rather than confrontation. But quiet diplomacy requires all parties to be willing to be managed, and William, by all accounts, is not easily managed by anyone. The question that hangs over all of this, the question that royal commentators and ordinary members of the public alike find themselves returning to repeatedly, is what it tells us about the monarchy that awaits Britain once William eventually takes the throne. Every signal, every action, every carefully chosen word and deliberately strategic silence points toward a reign that will be fundamentally different from anything that has come before it in living memory. Not different in the sense of dramatic rupture or revolutionary change. William is too committed to the institution, too deeply shaped by his sense of responsibility toward it, to pursue anything that would genuinely destabilize it. But different in terms of tone, in terms of the values that will be publicly prioritized, in terms of who is welcomed into the inner circle and who finds themselves, gently but unmistakably, outside it. There is a version of this story in which William is simply doing what every serious institution must periodically do, which is to clarify its own boundaries, restate its core purpose, and make the sometimes uncomfortable decisions that long-term sustainability requires. In this version, he is a reformer, imperfect and sometimes emotionally complex in his motivations, but ultimately oriented towards something genuinely important. The survival and renewal of an institution that has endured for centuries by being willing, when the moment demanded it, to change. And there is another version of this story in which a man who was never fully able to grieve his mother publicly, never fully able to express the anger and the loss and the sense of betrayal that Diana's story left inside him, is now using the only power available to him to say something he could not say in any other way. In this version, the paperwork and the protocol and the tiara discussions and the seating arrangements at state banquets are not really about institutional efficiency at all. They are about memory. They are about a boy standing at his mother's grave and a man who has never stopped standing there. No matter how many years have passed or how many official duties have required him to turn his face toward the future. The truth, as is almost always the case with human beings and the institutions they inhabit, is probably somewhere between these two versions. William is likely both the reformer and the son, both the future king thinking about the health of an institution and the child of Diana thinking about everything she endured, both motivated by duty and shaped by grief. The two things are not contradictory. They coexist in him, as they coexist in most of us, the public reasons we give for our actions, and the private history that makes those actions feel not just justified, but necessary.